Oh, it's so nice to be here. How's everyone doing? Have you been enjoying yourself so far? Yes, the weather has been absolutely beautiful. I'm here from Denver, Colorado, and we actually had snow last week. And not a little bit, a lot of snow. So while my wife is at home shoveling the driveway, I'm here enjoying the sunny weather in Bengaluru. So I appreciate it. Thank you for getting me out of my chores at home. This is my fourth year here at GIDS. I've really been enjoying it. As I was saying, my company is Thirsty It. I run a consultancy out of the United States. I spent quite a bit of my time as a Java developer and as a Groovy and Grails developer. If you've been at GIDS in years past, you've probably heard me speaking about those topics. If you're going to be back for the Java session, I'm definitely going to be talking about Groovy and good things like that. But for the past several years, I've been focusing on HTML5. And not just HTML5, but specifically mobile HTML5. Now, mobile entails having web apps running on your smartphones or your tablets, good things like that. Brought a couple of examples here, but I'm sure that you are all familiar with the basic form factors, the sizes of these kinds of things. What's especially interesting is, as well as doing development for smartphones and tablets, I've spent the last 3 years or so working with Time Warner Cable, a cable TV company in the States, focusing on smart TV development. And every modern Samsung TV, every modern LG TV that you purchase has a web browser in it. If it's got a Wi-Fi port, if it's got a Wi-Fi connection or an Ethernet port, it has a browser in it as well. I like telling my team of developers, imagine a device that has 100 times the screen real estate of your iPhone and 1/100th of the CPU power. And you get an idea of what it's like developing on a smart TV. But we were using Backbone, we were using jQuery, we were using jQuery, Backbone, underscore, all the basic libraries that you would normally do in desktop development on our smart TVs as well. So all of these kind of fall into this basic idea. This is a concept, this is an idea, this is an exact slide that I have in almost every one of my presentations now. As web developers, if you are not aware of mobile development techniques, you're really behind. The good news is you're here and you're wanting to learn about mobile techniques, right? But let me give you some statistics. Let me give you some reasons why the time you're spending honing your mobile web development skills are so important. Back in 2010, 3 years ago, smartphones outsold desktop computers. 3 years ago, more Android and iPhones were sold than Dells and Lenovo's. Now, just last year, 1 in 4 computers sold was a tablet. That was in 2012. This year, tablets are projected to outsell computers. So at this point now, we have smartphones outselling computers for the past 3 years. We have tablets outselling computers this year, 2013. What does that mean for PC sales? Oh, they're dropping like a rock. PC sales are down. They've been down 4 consecutive quarters in a row. But this last quarter was a 14% drop, the largest in history since they've been recording these stats back in the late 80s, early 90s. Do you see a pattern forming? In terms of hardware sales, we begin seeing that PC sales are going like this and mobile device sales are going like this. But when we look at usage as well, Google said that last year 1 billion of their users, 1 billion with a B, of their users used a mobile device as their primary way to access the internet. And I can attest to this. This is a generational change as well. Old guys like me still have computers at home. Yeah? All these young university students coming in. I was doing some consulting work at Yale University. I was doing some consulting work at Penn State University. All of these universities are discovering the same things. They say incoming freshmen are not coming to college with laptops. Incoming freshmen say, oh, I'll be able to go to the computer lab for that. Oh, I'm sure my roommate will do this for me. In many high schools, not university, secondary education schools, they are now issuing laptops to all incoming students. So the need for a student, a university student, to have a computer of their own is dramatically dropped. But do you think any university student is going to be able to be caught dead without their smartphone, without their tablet? And so what this means, Yale University said, all these incoming students want to be able to get their grades on their smartphones. They want to be able to talk to their instructors on their smartphones. They want to be able to recharge their cafeteria plan on their smartphones. You see that entire demographics are using mobile devices not only as their first way of accessing the internet, but for many of them, it's the only way they access the internet as well. So what does all this have to do with responsive web design then? Does responsive web design mean one size fits all, that I write my website once and I expect it to behave perfectly on every device? Now, we know what one size fits all means, don't we? This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Let me change it subtly. This is one website that's appropriate for all devices. This is not one-size-fits-all, but this is still a single development effort. This is still a single website that's appropriate across all these different devices. Do you see that subtle but important distinction? And let me take it one step deeper. If you think that your website is a dead, flat text file sitting in a file directory somewhere, that's how it used to be in the last century. Now our websites are living, breathing entities. Our websites are aware of their surroundings. Our websites are aware of the device they are running on and are able to respond to it appropriately. Does that make sense? This is a crucial concept. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page before we move on. This is now a living, breathing application. Your web browser now is self-aware enough that it even knows if it's online or not. When I come in here and I say Navigator online, my browser knows that it's connected to the internet. And it can do certain things based on the presence of that internet connectivity. It can do other things based on that internet connectivity not being there. Now, we're not going to be talking about offline applications today, but we're going to definitely be talking about applications that are aware of their surroundings and adjust their behavior accordingly. So, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about exactly what responsive web design is, and then we'll give you lots of code examples. These aren't big code examples. Some people come through this class and they say, is that it? And I take that as a compliment. Yes, that's it. These techniques I'm going to show you are ridiculously easy. There is no excuse not to be using these techniques that I show you today. Because as you're going to see, these techniques work across browsers, many of them even in Internet Explorer. Oh my gosh. All right. So, let's move forward. Let's talk a little bit more about responsive web design. I love that image because that captures it visually. Here, let's capture it in a sentence or two. Responsive web design is making sure that your website is aware of the device it's running on. Whether it's a smartphone, whether it's a tablet, whether it's a laptop or a desktop computer, or even a smart TV in your family room. Your website is a living, breathing entity that's aware of the device that it's running on, and it responds to the capabilities of that device accordingly. And this is important because smartphones come in a variety of different sizes. We can usually generalize saying they're either a 4 or a 5-inch device, but it really depends on the manufacturer. It depends on the capabilities. And we can measure size in a variety of different ways. We can say it's 4 to 5 inches. We can say that the resolutions it supports are all greater than 1024 pixels across. And then we start getting into pixels per inch, PPI, right? When Apple coined the phrase retina display, they were saying the pixel density was so tight on that phone that if we gave you more pixels, it'll just be wasted effort. Your eyes, your retina can't detect more than, in this case, about 326 pixels per inch. So as you see those pixels per inch, actually the Lumia has a higher pixel density than the iPhone 5. They can't call it retina display, that's a trade name, but the idea is the same. Even when we're looking at some of these Samsungs and a Nexus 4 and things like that, very high resolution displays. But we can see each one of them almost on a case-by-case basis is different than the next one. So you can imagine having to write a website once for a Samsung and once for an LG and one for an Apple and one for a Microsoft, one for this, one for that. No, we don't want to do that, do we? Now we have tablets to contend with. And tablets come in two basic form factors as well. When Apple came out with the original iPad, this is basically a 10-inch device. What they found, though, are there a lot of people who said this is a two-handed device. I have to sit here and read it like this. What if we actually trimmed it in half and it became a one-handed device? Now what's funny, our tablets are at 10-inch, but the really hot market segment right now are these 7-inch tablets, these kind of half-inch tablets. On the other hand, smartphones are getting bigger and bigger, so what started as a 3.5-inch device is getting closer to 5 inches. What started as a 10-inch device is now coming down to 7 inches. We've got this whole intermediate category now that people are calling phablets. Bigger than a phone, smaller than a tablet. But you got phablets in there as well that are coming in bigger than 5 inches, smaller than 7 inches. About 6 inches if my math is correct. Yeah. But what this means is we've got a wide range of devices from 3 inches all the way up to 10 inches and quite literally every size in between. Now, most of you who've been doing web development are aware of this idea of a user agent, right? That every browser identifies itself. When the request comes into the server, your browser says, "Hi, I'm Firefox. Hi, I'm Safari. Hi, I'm Chrome. Hi, I'm Internet Explorer." So these user agents can help us detect what device we're on, but we know that we can run multiple browsers on a given device. So that's no guarantee that there's a one-to-one correspondence. And oh yeah, by the way, the iPad mini reports exactly the same user agent as the iPad Maxi. That's a term I just made up on the spot right here. But to differentiate between the two, there is no way through user agent, there is no way through any kind of programmatic API to tell the difference between a 10-inch iPad and a 7-inch iPad. So this idea of doing development based on user agents is not something that's going to work for us in the mobile space. What that means is we need to have something a little bit more sophisticated. And we really don't care what device you're running on, and we really don't care what browser you're using. What we're most interested in are the capabilities of that device and the capabilities of that browser. And so what you're going to see here, all the examples I'm going to give you, are based on feature detection. I don't care that you're running on Safari on an OS X laptop, or you're running mobile Safari on a 10-inch iPad, or you're running mobile Safari on a 5-inch iPhone. I care about what your device is capable of doing, and I will adjust my website based on that. And what that means is you can future-proof your website. You can say, I don't care what browser you're on, I don't care what device you're on. If there's a brand new tablet that comes out, we are going to query your device on what it can do, not what the brand or the vendor is. Does that make sense? Excellent. All right. So I'm going to give you lots more code examples here, but let me say one more thing before we go. If you are building M-dot websites right now, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Now, I'm not saying you won't find lots and lots of examples of M-dot websites out, as opposed to www, right? You can go to www.yahoo.com and get one website. You can go to m.yahoo.com and get a different website. I spent 9 months at Yahoo running all their developers through training, helping them make all of the Yahoo properties, Yahoo Mail, Yahoo Sports, Yahoo News, Flickr, YUI, all those things, making them mobile ready, making them HTML5 compliant and mobile ready. And I beat them up every day I was there for 9 months for offering these M-dot URLs. Why am I so concerned about that? Am I just this delicate artiste that's easily offended? No. It's because I've been doing this for quite some time. I'm over 20 years in the industry now. I can remember the bad old days of web development when we had IE and Netscape Navigator battling for supremacy. Were any of you doing smartphone or feature phone or Palm Pilot development at that same era? Anyone? Anyone want to admit that? Okay, there are a few brave souls. I wouldn't admit it either. Yeah. The reason why we used to have M.dot domains, back in 1997, 1998, this was entirely the appropriate solution. Because if you were building websites for cell phones and Palm Pilots and Newtons and any other obsolete handheld computer you can think of at this point, those obsolete handheld computers were not powerful enough to render HTML. That's really saying something, isn't it? Because everything can render HTML these days. I have an exercise bike in my basement that has a web browser built into it. You can buy refrigerators that have web browsers built into it. If your refrigerator can render HTML, can you imagine a time when a phone could not? And so what they had to do is they had to use a simpler technology. They couldn't use HTML, hypertext markup language. They needed to use WML, wireless markup language. And HTML is served up over HTTP, Hypertext Transport Protocol. WML is served up over WAP, the Wireless Access Protocol. So this is what WML actually ends up looking like. You can see it doesn't begin with an HTML element. There aren't head sections and body sections and divs and paragraphs and things like that. You start with a WML. And you have cards, and each one of those cards has elements. So yes, about the only thing it has in similar with HTML are those pointy brackets. Other than that, it's a completely different language, a completely different syntax, a completely different render kit, served up using a completely different server. So just like you would have a mail.thirstyhead.com to serve up your SMTP traffic, and you would have ftp.thirstyhead.com to serve up your FTP traffic, and you would have www.thirstyhead.com to serve up your web traffic. You would also have m.thirstyhead.com to serve up your WAP. Does that make sense? So there was an entirely appropriate reason for having m.urls 20 years ago. Nowadays, we have devices that have full-fledged web browsers on them. Modern smartphones. I just picked up a Nexus 4. It's got a quad-core processor in it. It's got all the powerful in the world to render full HTML. So this idea behind m-dot is an idea from a bygone era. And let me give you one more reason why these m.urls are such a bad idea. Link rot. What happens when I am on my smartphone and I say, Venkat's giving a talk later today on unit testing JavaScript. He might really love this article. So on my smartphone, I click on the link and I send it to Venkat. Now, if I did that from my phone, my link would be m.yahoo.com, wouldn't it? Now, if Venkat gets this on his laptop, that's the URL he's going to get. He's going to click through that URL and he's going to get information that's inappropriate for that device. And if he turns around and says, Neil might be interested in this, Neil Ford, and he sends that to Neil and Neil reads it on his iPad, he's going to get an inappropriate link as well. This is incredibly short-sighted because it is built-in obsolescence. And at the end of the day, does Yahoo really care what device you're using to read that news story? It really doesn't, does it? It actually is in Yahoo's best interest to make it appear the same way, whether I'm on a smartphone or a tablet or a computer. They should be avoiding this kind of thing, not enforcing it. Now, I'm just using Yahoo as an example here. There are lots of companies out there that use the same strategy. So I am not picking on Yahoo. I've got a ton of respect for Yahoo, as a matter of fact. I'm just using this as one very easy to understand example. Yeah? So, rather than having an m.yahoo and a www.yahoo and a tablet.yahoo and a smart TV.yahoo and a DVD player.yahoo and a Blu-ray player.yahoo and, right? What we would much rather have is one website that's appropriate across different devices. So for all of this talk about responsive web design, boy, it's sure easier to demonstrate than explain. So let me do this. Let me show you this full screen right now, and I want you to notice that we've got 3 columns of photos and then a sidebar. Now this is running at 1024. That's what my screen resolution is right now, so I've maxed out my resolution. What happens when I drop below 1024? Do you notice my picture columns here? Went from 3 photos across to 2 photos across. Did I change URLs at all? No. It's the same URL. It's just adjusting itself. Now I want you to notice here, as I continue to resize that, I want you to notice something very important that will certainly hit a threshold here. But before I hit that threshold, what are you noticing about those images? They're adjusting accordingly as well, aren't they? If I looked at this as a CSS designer and I said, all right, I've got 2 divs that are 50% and 50%, and then within this kind of div, I have 2 more divs that are 50% and 50%. That's exactly how they've implemented it, using relative measures. And so what that means is regardless of the size of that device, I am always getting the appropriate layout. Now there are major thresholds. If that device is wide enough that it can handle 3 photos, it'll handle 3 photos. And if I were on a bigger screen, I could continue stretching it and showing you what happened when we got large. But so much of mobile design and responsive design is about adjusting for those smaller devices. So at some point, you'll see we hit a threshold. And not only do these divs stack instead of float, you'll also notice some things like these menus up here, conference workshop location. Those flip from something that is mouse pointer appropriate to big fat finger appropriate. Yeah? But the most important thing here is that if this is what it looks like on my desktop machine, and I come around here and I also try to view it on a smartphone. Oh. All right. What you would end up with is something that ends up looking like this. Appropriate for the smartphone. Branded appropriately. Same color scheme. Same information. But this layout is appropriate for the device it's being displayed on. Does that make sense? Do you want to clap? Isn't that cool? I get really excited about those kinds of things. This is one website appropriate for all devices. Now, Deconstruct is a software conference based out of the UK, and so it's entirely appropriate that a web design conference be aware of these kinds of things. But I don't want you to use this technique because it's very early on and very experimental, and really no one is using this technique. Oh, wait, Starbucks is. If you go to starbucks.com, you will turn around and you will see them using this. A little news magazine, you might have heard of them. I don't know if they're over here or not. Time Magazine? Yeah, of course they are, right? They're using this as well. You'll see example after example of websites using this responsive web design. And so the best thing I would recommend that you do is go out. Oh no! I used a bunch of these. I tried to load them up ahead of time, we can see it's not, the internet is very angry with me today. But we can see that as I come in here and resize Starbucks.com, there's some flash content that I'm blocking. But look at this, what's new. Look at this sign in, find a store. As I resize this, we begin seeing menus appear and disappear. We begin seeing content rearrange itself. We go from 2 columns down here down to 1 column. So website after website after website, you'll find these kinds of techniques. So what I've given you now is a bit of homework. I want you to go home now, and every website you visit, just resize that browser a whole bunch of times and see how it does. Yeah? Let me know how that works out for you. You'll see more and more companies using this technique all the time. If you want to see a bunch of cool examples, there's a website out there called Media Query. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's Media Queries, right? But it's in the .es domain right there. And media queries, as you're going to see, are exactly how responsive web design works. If responsive web design is the blanket term describing that resizy stuff, the technical implementation is done using CSS3 media queries. We'll give you some real examples of these. But if you want to see lots of cool examples of this responsive web design, go out to Media Query and look at the examples out there. If you want to read more about this, there is an outstanding book called Responsive web design. I know, not the most exciting title in the world, but it's great Google fodder, isn't it? Google that, you know what you're going to hit. You're going to hit lots of good free web articles out there giving you these kinds of information. But Responsive Web Design is a wonderful book. It's a very inexpensive book. It's about a US $9 PDF that you can download. It's a very short book on the order of about 130 pages or so. But what I love the most about it is Ethan Marcotte, the author, starts with a website that looks good on a desktop and iteratively refactors it to make it more and more and more mobile friendly. And then the very last chapter of the book, after he's taken a desktop website and made it look good on a mobile device, the very last chapter, he takes it in the other direction and makes it look good on a smart TV as well. Outstanding resource if you're trying to pick up more on this technique. But let me give you just a couple of simple things you can do. Incredibly simple, but pay dramatic dividends in terms of making your website far less hostile to smartphones and tablets. And the first thing we have to do is we have to understand what a viewport is. Now, indulge me if you would. I'm not going to move on until I get every one of you to make a telescope with both hands. All right? This is the interaction part. Everyone needs to make a telescope and look around through it, okay? Everyone does this. You look ridiculous. My gosh. But I'm not moving on until every single one of you has to look around through your telescope. Guess what? You are now mobile smartphone web developers. Because that is how the web looks on your iPhone. You're looking at the web like this. Yeah? It wasn't that bad, was it? All right. This is your viewport. So let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about what that means. The screen is different than the window, is different than the viewport. So being able to have each one of those clear in our minds is very important. Now, I don't need to just explain to you the difference between a screen and a window, right? There are entire operating systems dedicated to this concept of having multiple programs up and running in resizable windows. Yeah, that's not a brand new concept. What is interesting, though, is through JavaScript, we can programmatically query these things. Again, one of the most important things about a responsive web design is making sure that it's aware of the device constraints or the device capabilities. So just like over here, I was looking at Navigator online, knowing whether or not I have an internet connection. I can also say screen width and screen height. Now realize I'm in the browser, right? I'm in my web browser. I'm using Google Chrome right now. But what I'm able to do through JavaScript is query and see what my screen resolution is. Now that's helpful knowing how big the entire screen is. But I also have the ability to go in and see what my window size is. What's interesting about this is I have to ask for the inner width and the inner height, as well as the outer width and the outer height. What do you suppose the difference is between those values? What's the difference between the inner height and the outer height of the browser window? All of you are saying the right thing. I used to say that the inner width and height is my canvas, but I can't say that anymore because that means something different now, doesn't it? But we can think of it as our palette, our usable area. So my inner height, the reason why that's only showing up as about 200 pixels is because it is just the usable area of my browser. It's the area where I can display my content. So the inner height doesn't include scroll bars, it doesn't include the status line, it doesn't include menus, the URL line, the bookmark bar, any of those kinds of things. So the inner width and height is just that, my area that I can use. The outer width and height is the entire dimension of the window. So while that's nice that I can programmatically ascertain those things, there is a third thing. There is a thing beyond windows and beyond screens. And that third thing, you know where I'm going, right? Yeah. But that third thing is the viewport. And we've had viewports since the very beginning of the web, but we've rarely been concerned about them on desktop computers. But that third thing, that viewport, you can think of as your document. And if your document is wider than the window, you get scroll bars, right? If that document is taller than the window, you get scroll bars. Now, what's interesting about the web is we're all used to scrolling vertically. We don't think twice about scrolling vertically. We hate scrolling horizontally, don't we? So much of what you're going to see in these examples are us being concerned about the width of the browser window or the width of the viewport. We're less concerned about the height, although we could come up with use cases for that. But we're typically trying to avoid the horizontal scroll, and that means being well aware of what the width is of these devices. Another way to think of this is anytime you're on your device and you're pinching and stretching with your fingers, help me out. Are you resizing your screen? It's still a 5-inch iPhone, isn't it? Are you resizing the window? No. Ironically, on these mobile devices, they typically don't have resizable windows. The window is running full screen. So on mobile devices, you're less concerned about screen and window information. But that viewport, every time you're pinching and stretching, you're zooming in and out on the viewport. The way we control that is through a meta tag, ironically named Viewport. So let's see what this looks like. When I'm hanging out right here, I'm running on a local website right here, port 8000 right here. I've got this information. Now when I look at that on a smartphone, we can see already that some of that information is wrapping around. Responsive web design is wrapping around, but it still looks fairly good, doesn't it? And if we look at the source code for this, the reason why it looks good is because I've gone in and I've said I want my viewport to be the width of my device. What happens if I take that out? When I come back to my desktop, nothing. I'm refreshing all day long. Nothing's happening there. Because we're less concerned about the viewport on the desktop than we are on a smartphone. What does that do for me here? I know you can't open up Deconstruct, but we were on localhost. There we go. We can see we end up with teeny tiny text, right? Now, again, if I wanted to, I could turn around and I could stretch this out. Oops. I can stretch this out so I can see it. And since I don't have two mice on my device, this emulator, this is the emulator that comes with Xcode. I'm using the Alt key to give me two fingers. So the Alt key is what allows me to pinch and stretch. And while that's fine, I could go in and resize that. Wouldn't it be nicer just to turn around and say, you know what, just go ahead and size that viewport appropriately. Size it so that it's on the width. And this initial scale means I am not initially zooming in or zooming out. That initial scale is coming in at 1.0. So what that means now is every time I'm on this device, hey, it's going to come in at the right size. But notice what else I've been able to do here. If I change my device from an iPhone to an iPad, and go back and view this, it's appropriate on this device as well. So any device that I happen to be running it on, because I've said I want the width to be device width, I now have a responsive web design. Does that make sense? That's one line of code. Do you feel comfortable adding one line of code to your websites? Yeah? Now, if you don't, let me offer up the New York Times as a cautionary tale. I don't have good internet connectivity here, so I can't demonstrate it for you, but if you go to www.nytimes.com on your smartphone, it looks great as long as you can read microscopic text. Because you've got a website that looks wonderful on a desktop, but does not resize itself appropriately for your smartphone. So the content is there, but you constantly have to pinch and stretch in order to use it. Now, if you go to m.newyorktimes.com, you'll get an appropriate mobile experience. But I ought to be able to just go to New York Times on any device and have it do the appropriate thing. It's really unfair to ask me, the human, to decide which URL I want to visit based on the device that I'm on. Yeah? So that's just dealing with the viewport. That's a one-liner. And let me reiterate this. That viewport setting is a complete no-op for desktop devices. So you can add that one-liner, that viewport line, to every single one of your web pages. Go home tonight and do it. Because it has zero effect on desktop browsers. But it has the immediate effect of making your content appropriate on whatever device you're viewing it on. And did you notice how that never said iPhone or iPad or Samsung or LG or Chrome or Safari or mobile Firefox? I don't care. What I want you to do is make this width the width of the device. That's responsive web design. All right. Let's talk about the next thing. Fixed equals broken. I'll wait for a moment as you ponder that. Huh? What? What I'm talking about here are fixed measurements will break your website on mobile devices. So let's talk about these fixed measurements. Wow, that looks like the New York Times on a smartphone. This is a study, this is information that W3C Schools put out. And they said, here are our resolutions. They said today, most computers are using a screen resolution of 1024 or higher. Now, back in 2011, literally, 99% of their visitors came to them with a device that supported 1024 pixels or higher. Okay, I lied to you just a little bit. It's 98.9% of all their visitors, right? But do you remember those resolutions that we had on the iPhones and on the smartphones? All of them are typically 1240 or higher. So this is not a screen size issue. This is a screen resolution issue. That's exactly why the New York Times looks so awful on an iPhone. Because of that Retina display, because the pixels are so small, you can get almost 1024 on an iPhone 4. You can definitely get 1024 on an iPhone 5. So knowing that back in 2011, 99% of the market came to us using 1024 or higher browsers, what that meant is we ended up with the 960 grid as a de facto standard. Now, wait a second. That math's a little bit off, isn't it? Why not 1024? Why 960? What's significant about the number 960? It's about 95% of 1024. So the reason why 960 became so popular is because it gave you a little bit of border, a little bit of gutter around all of your stuff. Now I say it's about 95. Technically it's 93.25% of that. Because 960 is a magic number, it breaks really nicely into a bunch of multiples. 960 would give me 12 columns, or it gives me 10 columns, or it gives me 8 columns, or it gives me 6 columns, or 4 columns, or 3, or 2, or even 1 column. And the math works out really, really nicely. So that's why 960 is such a magic number. So this is following those up a little bit more, but this is the easiest way to kind of visualize it. So if your width is 960 and you have 12 60 pixel columns in there with gutters in between each one of them, you can see this has been a standard layout for web developers for years now. Certainly since the mid-2000s. So if we turned around and applied the same idea, if we said, all right, I'm going to have a content area down here, and I'm going to hard code the width of that to 600 pixels, right? Because that's exactly what all of these designs would do. They would hard code 960, and they would hard code column widths. They would hard code all those kinds of things. How do you think that 600 pixel screen is going to look on a desktop computer? No problem at all, right? This is my 600 pixels right there. Looks like a champ. How do you think that's going to look on a smartphone? Crummy? You're right. Because, oops, let's come in here and refresh this. There we go. Oops, well, let's do one more thing here. I sabotaged myself. You see what I did? I said width equals device width. This is what I wanted to show you here. Is that coming in here now, we're either going to be presented with something like that, which looks awful, or when we come back in and re-enable that, I'm going to have to do a lot of horizontal scrolling, aren't I? Based on that viewport. There is no way I'm going to be able to comfortably fit 600 pixels across all these devices. So what I want to do instead is I want to say I want the width to be 95%. Any place you find yourself using fixed measurements, if you replace it with relative measurements, then all of a sudden, regardless of the device you're on, if I am on this device, we can see 95% gives me that little gutter. Now, normally what I would do as well is I would center this, and so that 5% would be spread across both gutters. Right? I've got all 5% tucked on the backside right here. But I did that just so we can turn around and we can see now that based on this relative, I've got that same 5% gutter. Now my words are wrapping differently. Here I get bacon ipsum, and I don't have a website. You're familiar with lorem ipsum, right? Lorem ipsum is just fake Latin words. I prefer bacon ipsum, which fills all that text with bacon, frankfurter, pastrami, pork belly, shank, tail, chuck, pancetta, all kinds of good meat like that, right? If you're vegetarian, you don't want to use bacon ipsum. Yeah? But what I want you to notice here is that on my smartphone, I cut off at pastrami. Over here, that's where pastrami cuts off. So once again, what I have is a display that's wrapping accordingly. If I made that div 600 pixels wide, it's not going to wrap. It's going to force that horizontal scroll. But by saying I want that to be 95% wide, it's appropriate across all devices. Yeah? Something as simple as this. Anytime you're using a fixed measurement, anytime you're using a pixel, you ought to consider using a percentage. Anytime you're using a point size on your font, you might want to consider using an M instead. Are you familiar with M as a measurement? Yeah. M is just what it sounds like. This dates way back to the days of the Gutenberg Bibles, the very beginning of printing presses. M is the widest letter of the alphabet, which is typically a capital letter M. And so it's a relative measure. So you're using the capital letter M as your unit of measure. So regardless of what your font set is, you are always saying a 1.M, 1.0M is going to be as wide as the capital letter M. If you want your text to be twice as big, you want it to be 2 M's. If you want it to be half as big, you want it to be 0.5 M's. Do you see how that works? If you use these relative measures, then all of a sudden it'll be appropriate across all devices. So we can turn around and use these same concepts. If we wanted to add columns, this is what it would end up looking like. I have a content that has a width of 95%, but then I have a couple of columns that are 50%. What's so nice is that these percentages are relative to the container. So when I said my container is 95% of the width, and then columns 1 and 2 are 50%. They're 50% of their container. And so using these relative measures, you can go all the way down. If I wanted to set a fixed width on that container, I would know that everything would be relatively correct inside. So being able to set up columns using 50% means it's appropriate for all devices as well. Yeah? What about images? Most people get so concerned about images saying, oh boy, I hate it when images spill over, right? We must have to use fixed pixels on images. Do you remember Deconstruct as we were resizing that? We can use percentages on our images as well, because those image widths and heights will be relative. But there's one more thing you want to do when it comes to images. And it can be literally a one-liner right here. But if you say max width is 100%. And notice I just did that on the image tag. So I'm saying across every single image tag on my entire website, I want the max width to be 100%. This means you will never outgrow your container. This photograph will never spill out of the column that it's in because I gave it a max width value of 100%. Yeah? Good. Good. Very subtle things when it comes to fixed versus relative measurements. But the simple thing you ought to keep in your mind is if you're doing fixed measurements, you're doing it wrong. Because there's no way that you can come up with a pixel dimension that is going to be appropriate for a 5-inch smartphone and a 7-inch tablet and a 10-inch tablet and a 15-inch laptop and a 30-inch computer monitor and a 60-inch TV. There is no way you'll be able to come up with a fixed measurement that will be appropriate in all those. That's a one-size-fits-all solution. We want something that is relative, that responds to the width. And if I say I want you to be 50% of the screen, it's always going to work, isn't it? I don't care what screen size you are, you're going to be 50% of it. Relative measures are key to responsive web design. But the last thing I want to talk about here are media queries. And remember, that's that really cool website you can go to, Media Queries. Yeah. But media queries here are really the key to responsive web design. Now, this has been available to us since CSS2, being able to pull in a style sheet. But do you notice how it says media equals screen? That's why they're called media queries, right? This means that this style sheet will only be appropriate if you're on a screen. What's the other very common value that you use? Print, absolutely. And so this is very common as well. Now you could turn around and do this as you're downloading the style sheet, or you can do inline things in there as well. And so this is saying, hey, guess what? If I'm on a screen, I want this font size. If I'm in print, I want that font size. Yeah? There were a whole bunch of possible CSS2 media queries. The only two anyone ever used were print or screen, because the others were too oblique. They didn't really mean anything. What does handheld mean? What can I generalize when it comes to both of these? These are both handhelds, aren't they? Yeah. So that handheld wasn't nearly as valuable as what CSS3 brought, which are media queries. Being able to say that this is not only for the screen, but a screen that has a max width of 320 pixels, I want to apply this style to it. Yeah? Media queries are just that. They're queries. It's like SQL for your browser. Only instead of saying select first name from customer, where city equals Bengaluru, we're saying select these elements for the screen if my screen has a max width of these dimensions. And we can do a lot more than simply screen dimensions. We can figure out what the orientation of your device is. I'm going to give you examples of whether you're in portrait or landscape mode. You can figure out what your aspect ratio is. At Time Warner Cable, we could tell if you're on a standard def TV, a 4:3 TV, or a high def TV, a 16:9, by doing a media query on the device. We can even tell what the scan is. Are you on a 1080i, which is interlaced, or a 1080p progressive? So we have a lot of sophisticated media querying that we can do. But one example of that is having our columns stack based on what device I'm on. So if I'm on a device like this, I want to see my columns stacked side by side. If I'm on a device like this, oops, stacked columns, there we go. I want my columns to end up going like this, right? And the way I was able to do that is in my media query saying, hey, if I'm on a screen that has a max width of 480 pixels, go ahead and set my column width to 95%. Otherwise, float them and make it 50%. Do you see how that selectively works? And oh, by the way, I can even test it here. Boom. So now all of a sudden you know exactly how they were doing this kind of thing as well, right? All they were doing was paying attention to the viewport width and stacking their things accordingly. One-liner. Media query. All right. What else? Portrait versus landscape. Ah, yeah. I love dealing with designers because when we're dealing with mobile designs, they have to design every single page twice. They hate that. They say, is there any way you can stop that? It's like, no, there isn't a JavaScript API that will send shocks to the user if they do that. Ow, ow, no, I can't do that. Ow, it hurts. No. Yeah, until that JavaScript API exists, we're stuck designing for both portrait and landscape. And this is how you do it. A media query. A simple one-liner once again, saying if I'm in portrait orientation, do this. If I'm in landscape orientation, do this. So, when we're trying to experiment with source code, it's fun being able to say, okay, I'm in landscape mode, so I'm green, and over here, I'm in portrait mode, because I'm red. If you want to see the source code, you'll be sorely disappointed, right? It's just if I'm in portrait mode, I'll be red. If I'm in landscape mode, I'll be green. So coming over here, it's fairly easy for me to test based on this. By the way, I'm using the Apple key and an arrow key to flip my simulator into portrait and landscape mode. And we can see this as a query. It's dynamically querying that based on that device. And I'm a pretty smart guy. This is a joke. That's the only reason I would start a statement that way. I'm a pretty smart guy. I said, this is a very sophisticated device, you see. It's got an accelerometer in it. It's got a gyroscope, and they're probably magnets, and somehow it knows where the North Pole is, and it's figuring out what's going on. That's what I thought, at least. Do you know what the definition of portrait versus landscape is? If you are taller than you are wide, you are in portrait mode. If you are wider than you are tall, you are in landscape mode. I'm in landscape mode, right? Yeah? So these are the kinds of things you can even test in your browser without fancy simulations. When you're in landscape mode, you typically want your list items to scroll horizontally. That too ends up being literally a one-liner. In portrait mode, your unordered list is going to behave like it normally would. It would scroll vertically. But when I get into landscape mode, all I have to do is one-liner. I need to make my LIs float, and then all of a sudden they do the right thing. Were you scared about any of these techniques I showed you at this point? It's almost embarrassing standing up here and talking about these things, because in each case, it was literally a one-liner. But can you see how a one-liner here, and a one-liner there, and a one-liner there goes a remarkable distance towards making your website mobile-friendly? And at the end of the day, that's what responsive web design is all about. Responsive web design is making sure that your living, breathing website is aware of the device that it's on, and it can respond accordingly. Through the viewport, through the avoidance of any fixed measurements whatsoever, and through the judicious use of those media queries, you will absolutely be able to have one website that's appropriate across all devices. Did you enjoy yourself? I did. Thank you very much.